Great. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here this morning and to speak to all of you. And I thank you for coming at one of the busiest times of your semester. If you're anything like me, it's kind of a hectic, crazy time and you feel like you're drowning, but hopefully we can take your mind off of that for a minute. My name is Samantha Miller, and I'm part of the Intercultural Studies MA program. I'm in my last year, and it's been a great ride so far. When Clayton emailed me asking me to speak this past summer, this day, December 5th, sounded like it was so far away. I was sitting in my room at the Baptist Missionary Society guest house in Kolkata, India, and I was busy doing about 6 weeks of research for my master's thesis at the time. And on the day I received his email, I just remember I had returned from a full day of interviews, and I was exhausted and I was overwhelmed, and I had just spoken to a bunch of Christians that were working to combat sex trafficking in Kolkata's largest red light district called Sonagachi. And so I had a lot on my mind. I was pretty sweaty from the long, hot, and humid day, and I opened up this email, and I said, ooh, I feel really inadequate to be up here speaking in front of these people. I had seen some of the graduate students last year, and I thought their stories were awesome. And so I thought, oh no, why did he ask me? So I thought of all the excuses I could come up with, and I realized none of them would be adequate enough, so I should say yes and just pray that God would bring something to me in time. So here we are today, and I'm still not sure I have anything that's very good to say to you, but my prayer is just that something I say that God has given me will speak to somebody here, and it'll be adequate. So caveats aside, I will stop the disclaimers, and I'll just jump into it. So I'm going to rewind to about a year ago. A year ago, I was in the U.S. military, and I was working as a special agent in the Air Force. Some of you may have seen the TV show NCIS. I personally don't watch it, but the Air Force has something like that, and it's called OSI. And imagine NCIS, but take out all the strong flavor of Hollywood and stretch things out a lot longer period of time, and that's about what my job was like. So I was charged with investigating crimes against the U.S. Air Force, and that brought me into interview rooms with people who had committed some pretty heinous crimes, things like murder, some people like committed fraud, things that seem a little less intense than murder. There was sexual assault, a lot of those cases, and narcotics. I also did some counterterrorism work. So my job was really to collect the facts. I was supposed to sit there and find out as much as I could, and I was really punitively oriented at the time. I was trying to find out who was responsible for what had happened, and my ultimate goal was to hope that he or she would be put in jail. And that was kind of the end of the road for us in those days when I was doing that work. So I loved my job in the military, but during this time I really felt God calling me to something else, and it seemed odd because I loved what I was doing, but I just felt this strong pull to step out in faith. And my husband, Ryan, was serving as an active duty officer as well, and he was an engineer, and he was feeling the same pull. So we decided, this must be from God. We don't know what we're doing, and despite what our parents think, we're going to follow God. So we left the military after we finished our commitment, and we moved from Washington, D.C. here to Wheaton, Illinois, and I started this program. My husband was selfless enough to get a job in the area to support us, and I thank him for that. So here I am studying full-time, and from the beginning of this program, I knew I wanted to write a thesis. I knew there was a lot of wisdom in my department, and I wanted to learn how to write better. So I was oriented on all things justice, and I sat down with my advisor, Dr. Greener, and told her, I have a heart for social justice. Who doesn't, right? And I'd like to do something not punitively oriented, not focused on offenders, but completely focused on victims. And I'm interested in sex trafficking. And so she encouraged me. Dr. Moreau and others in the department at the time said, okay, let's see how that takes shape. So I also had a professor at the time, and he would always talk about the Luke Acts, he said. And he always encouraged us to look at Luke Acts and think about it. And so I thought, I better go back and read those two books of the Bible. So I was taking time in my quiet time to work through the book of Luke and then Acts. And at this time, I was really just ingrained in stories of victims of sex trafficking. I had watched a lot of documentaries and read a lot of books, and I was really immersed in stories of the Bible that talked about God's love for the marginalized. And I was really viewing that. I was really just passionate about working toward that. So before I started reading Luke 15 on that day, I just prayed that God would illuminate whatever he wanted me to see in the passage. And I started reading. And while I read, I really heard this voice say, "What about the offenders of sex trafficking?" And I thought, just kept reading. And then I heard again, "What about justice for the offenders?" And I mean, most of the people who know me in this room know that I'm usually not afraid to give my opinion or challenge the status quo, but even that was a little too far for me. I didn't really want to focus a paper on offenders of sex trafficking, on traffickers. Most people don't even like to think about them. So I thought, okay, I'll go back and reread the passage through the lens of a trafficker. What would God be saying? So I looked at the audience. Jesus was talking to Pharisees who were angry that he was meeting with sinners. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I started seeing things that were interesting to me, something like in the parables about the lost sheep, right? There's more joy in heaven when one sinner or trafficker repents than when 99 righteous people, follow the Lord, or who don't need repentance follow the Lord. And then I thought about the story of the lost coin, someone using a light to illuminate the darkest places. And immediately I had this picture of these brothels I'd seen in these documentaries that were really dark. And I thought, the passage says there's joy in the presence of God's angels over one sinner, or in my lens, trafficker, who is found in that dark place and repents. And then I thought about the prodigal son, and I read something I hadn't really focused on before, that he spent his money on prostitutes and wild living. And that's when I thought, okay, this is getting weird. So I could identify with that older brother who didn't want to go into that party with the trafficker. I thought the sinner in this case really is what the parable says. But I just thought, what is God trying to say? So that perspective really changed the direction of my thesis, to tell you the truth. I began to wonder, what does justice really mean? What are we comfortable with justice meaning, and what does it holistically mean? What does God's justice mean? Dr. Wheaton talks about how, justice is originated by God. Justice centers on God. And I believe that. I think that, God is the perfect originator of justice, and the definition of justice comes from God. So I thought, what does that mean for me as I try to follow God? So my journey brought me to Dr. Karen Swanson in the Prison Ministries office at the Billy Graham Center. And she opened my eyes to this concept of restorative justice, which I hadn't thought about much. This alternative that was started by some Mennonites in Canada in the 1970s. And it really brings the offender and the victim and some community members together to dialogue about crime. The goal is really to look at the harm caused by crime and to try to heal that. It's this idea of shalom. And I talked to her about, how can I understand this better, this other person that I'm not really in the right mindset for? And she said, I think you should talk to Chaplain Tom. He works here, he does a lot of work in prisons. You could get plugged in through him. So when I thought about preparing for today, I thought I could talk to you about my thesis. Some people don't want to hear any more about my thesis, like my sweet husband. But instead of doing that, I really want to share this platform with Chaplain Tom, and I think he offers just a really unique picture of what God thinks about justice that can speak to those of us who might be punitively minded or more comfortable with stopping at jail and not thinking beyond that. So I want to invite him up here to share with you now, and I'll come back at the very end and conclude for us, but I'd like to pass it on to him now.
Good, thanks. Good morning. Let's see, I look around the room, and in 1979, which is before some of you were born, and anyway, that's okay. In 1979, I was in jail again for the umpteenth time in my life. As a matter of fact, I counted back from memory that I was at that time living in the 16th correctional institution that jails, prisons, correctional centers, and so forth. In and out, and in and out, and in and out, and in and out for years. I did not fall into the wrong crowd, I promise you. I was the wrong crowd. You know, and one of the sadder parts of my memory is all the people that I trained, so to speak, to live that lifestyle. I was 30 years old then. I had never in my life opened a Bible until then. You know, my cellmate was reading a Bible. I'd seen lots of people read Bibles in jails and prisons. It's a kind of a popular thing to do. But I would watch these Bible readers get out and go straight to the bar or the dope house, or worse. I saw many people literally get out of jail after breakfast, and they would be back for supper. They would be rearrested that fast. I didn't have much respect for religion. I was not raised in a Christian home and so forth. So when I saw my cellie reading this Bible, I said, "Why are you reading that book?" Referring to it, that book, in a derogatory way. He said, "Well, my wife is a Christian, and my wife and her Christian friends are really neat people." That might have been, I didn't think about it a whole lot right then and there, but that might have been the first time in my life I ever heard those kind of people referred to in a positive way. His wife's pastor was visiting him every week. So I asked my cellie, "Would you ask that pastor," this is the first time I ever did this in my life, believe me, "would you ask that pastor if he would talk to me someday?" And being a pastor, he did, of course. You know, they're paid to do that, right? And he told me I needed a relationship with Jesus Christ. I didn't really buy what he had to say. I was very skeptical. We did talk for about 20 minutes. When I went back to my cell, that's when I asked my cellie if I could look at his Bible. That was the first time I'd ever opened a Bible in my life. I started on page 1, like you read any book. You know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and I worked my way through Genesis and Exodus, and yes, even Leviticus and Numbers, and I just kept reading it, and God used it, and God got under my skin and into my heart, and, you know, and the long and short of it is, I won't go into every detail, but the long and short of it is, I came to the conviction that God loved me and that Jesus died for my sins, and it wasn't just that he died for the sins of everybody, he died for my sins. And I received Christ as my Savior. He changed my whole life. That was 33 years ago. I've never been the same since. I've had the privilege of working in jails and prisons. I had the privilege 7 years later to go back to that same jail and be a staff chaplain after I got the privilege of going to Bible college and so forth. And it is a privilege. At least to me it is. And I'm sure it is to you as well. When I got out of jail in March of 1980, I was only doing 4 months at the time. I started going to a church. That was something new for me too, you know. But the men in that church, it was just a small church, a couple hundred people. But the men in that church adopted me unofficially you know, they used to invite me over to their homes after church, my wife and I, and invite me to watch the game and so forth. But those men displayed for me what it was like to be a mature Christian man. You see, I had set my goal as becoming the kind of man that God wanted me to be. I mean, isn't that what we want, men? You know? And ladies, you want to become the kind of lady that God created us to be. I didn't want to settle for what I wanted to be. I wanted what he wanted. I really did. Those men showed me what kind of man God wanted me to be. I didn't know. I didn't grow up with that. I had not had Christian men in my life prior to that. They showed me how a mature Christian man related to his wife. They showed me, they displayed for me, they modeled for me how a mature Christian man related to his kids, and so forth. I owe those men a lifetime's worth of debt, believe me. But I got to tell you something. Jail and prison do not change people. Certainly, at least they don't change people for the better. You know, only Jesus Christ changes people's lives. I'm preaching to the choir, I reckon, but you know, the beginning has to start in the heart, right? You know, and only Jesus can change a man's heart. And that's why nationwide, 80%, 75, 80% of people that leave jail and prison are back within 3 years. They go right back to the same old garbage, the same old lifestyle. You know, they think they've learned how to be better criminals, which is an oxymoron. Okay, there is no such thing as a better criminal. You know, when a criminal becomes better, he becomes a law-abiding citizen. But anyway, jails and prisons have lots of good programs. You know, people need job skills, they need educational skills and so forth. I'm not against any of that stuff. But I got to tell you, job skills and educational skills do not change people's lives. You know, they might make some temporary surface changes. You know, before I went to jail the last time, I was a college graduate. You know, and I had a great job, a great career in front of me, and so forth. I'm a Penn State graduate in nuclear engineering and so forth, and all this neat stuff. That stuff does not change people's lives. Jesus Christ does. You know, all those things are good, and I'm not against them at all. But government employees can only provide so much. You know, even government employees that know Jesus are essentially prohibited by law from talking to people about Jesus in those facilities. Unless we Christians go into those facilities, you know, they just remain dark, believe me, real dark. One of the greatest things is, I've only lived in Illinois for 5 years. One of the greatest things that's happened, one of the best things that's happened to the Illinois Department of Corrections is that the state of Illinois, like many other government entities, particularly in our country, is broke. You know, so they don't have any money. So they withdraw money from all the different departments and so forth. And I get a call from a warden that says, "Tom, we just lost our funding for our substance abuse program. Do you have anything that can substitute?" I said, "Al, I'm a Bible teacher. I don't teach substance abuse, but I do have a little course a 10-week course that I put together for another youth. I'll bring it down to you. And the warden and his chief counselor looked at this. It's just a Bible study course, folks, but it does talk about substance abuse. They said, well, this is just what we need. This is just what we want. So every Wednesday morning in that facility now, one of our volunteers leads a class, it's a voluntary class, but it's strongly encouraged by the administration. It's called Spiritual Healing. It's a Bible study course. It's the best thing that happened to that facility, I believe. The government doesn't have, the Department of Corrections doesn't have the money to bring in people to do their counseling and their programs. They do have some, but they're non-Bible counselors and they're non-Bible programs and so forth. But they're running short on all this stuff because they don't have enough. So it makes people like us more valuable, And I started teaching some dads classes, and they looked at it and they said, "Oh, please, could you take this to every male prison in the state?" So they opened up the doors to every prison in the state for us to take a Christian seminar bringing the gospel to inmates in the context of fatherhood. Why fatherhood? There's no other subject that can excite the hearts of men more than fatherhood. Most of these inmates are dads, and they don't want their kids to follow them. But the average is that the children of inmates are 7 times more likely to become inmates than other kids. Follow the leader, like father, like son. And inmates, being locked up is crummy. But having your kid locked up is even crummier. So they want to become better dads. We bring them the gospel. Jesus Christ changes people's lives. I'm not atypical. I am a typical ex-inmate. Honestly, I'm all for justice, believe me. But the only true justice is God's justice. And God's justice is reconciliation. God wants us to reconcile with Him, Seriously, I could not count how many times I got out of jail and said, that's it. I'm going to straighten up and fly right because I don't want to go back there. Jail's good for that. I don't want to go back there. It's crummy. But depending on who met me at the gate, I would be a block away, 2 blocks away, and my partner would go, "Let's party. You're out. We'll celebrate." And all my good intentions would drift away with the smoke. Because although I was released from jail, I wasn't free, folks. Because freedom is the ability to do what is right in spite of and in the face of everybody else wanting you to do what's wrong. And if people aren't set free before they leave jail, they'll be back because they're not free. It is for freedom that Christ set us free. We Christians need to go into these jails and prisons. 80% going back. Of the 20% that don't go back, how many of them, what percentage of them do you think became believers? I don't really know for sure, but I do know this. I know the tendencies of the human heart. If you did wrong once, you're going to do it again. And if you don't, it's a miracle. And we need to see more miracles, don't we? We need more Christians bringing the gospel to more inmates. I'd like to talk to you for the next hour. You would not like me to talk to you for the next hour. Samantha's going to come back up and close us off. There's going to be a short presentation on the screen after this is all over. If you want to look at it, it's not very long. You might like it, you might not. I've got some literature back there. It's got my email address on it. If you'd like to get hold of me, if you'd like to know any more about this, if you'd like to go to prison with me, I would welcome you, and I can probably make a way, because I work for a way maker. Thanks.